So welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us in this webinar format of this book talk. We're really excited to talk to you about our recently co-edited book, A Praxis of Possibilities, Creative and Critical Research for Social Justice with Young People is the title of our talk tonight. And we're here, the four of us, to have an interactive kind of panel discussion format. And we're very grateful and appreciative of the Mills College School of Education for hosting this, and for Dean Wendy Williams for kind of coming up with the idea and igniting this book talk event. So thank you all for being here. And I'll turn it to Dean Williams, who might say a few words.
Thank you, Dana, and welcome everyone. You know, it is quite a feat to have survived and to be surviving in a pandemic, and even more so to produce a book in the midst of it. So I only feel that we were not able to feel sorry that we weren't able to be as responsive earlier on in the process when Dr. Wright and her colleagues' book was initially published during a very momentous year. So we're still in it, but very glad to have you all join us this evening and to be in dialogue with them about their work. And so I thought I would share a few thoughts or words about the power of youth voice. You know, the power and possibility in youth voice has always been there. However, it seems of late we've become more humbled by the need to listen to them, and so have gotten more ready to do that. And I think it's certainly about time. And I think about the number of ways in which young people are calling our attention to them and to the vision that they have for a future that they deserve. It's quite remarkable. Whether it's Fridays for Futures, the protest that were in Glasgow, and remember they were out in the pouring rain, really speaking to, you know, maybe wanting a bit more action and commitment by our governmental leaders in COP26. The work of young people, Dana actually, Dr. Wright is responsible for and stewards a group of young people each year in a partnership across multiple institutions at the Highlander Center for Research and Education in Tennessee, a remarkable place and one that's featured in this text. As well as just of late, we've really been thinking about how to reach deeper and earlier into the pipeline to inspire young people to become educators. Our educator preparation programs are fraught with this need to prepare folks very, very quickly, but that also means sometimes they feel underprepared. And so our School of Education partner, Dr. Misha Mosley, who leads the Black Teacher Project, has been leading a cohort of young people. They'll be doing it for the second time this spring, Youth Reimagining Schools, which is a program funded by the Hewlett Foundation, but is sponsored by our School of Education. So when I saw the title of this text and I thought about some of the many ways in which we engage that work, it made me feel so excited and proud that we could even delve more deeply into this work and your work this evening. So thank you again for being with us in multiple time zones and timeframes. Engaging youth in critical arts pedagogies and creative research for social justice. It's a comprehensive text. I had an opportunity to actually physically maneuver with the book. Dana allowed me to view her copy. And so it's, you know, grounded in firm theoretical foundations, but also in practice. And I think that that's one of the pieces that stands out to me and that folks, I think, will draw many good lessons from. Notes from the field is a critical feature of this text, in which folks who are in the work can describe and talk about it. So again, you know, Dana, Dr. Wright is a valued colleague. And we are so grateful to invite her colleagues, Drs. Kristen Gosling, Amanda Wade, and Dr. Marie Dewhurst as well. So thank you all for being here and also for doing the good work of amplifying those youth voices and the folks who do that good work with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Williams. We're going to just introduce ourselves in the chat and just share with us in the chat. We can see your writings in the chat, your name, your pronouns. For example, my pronouns are she and her, the land that you are on, and we're going to put a link in the chat so that you can see a map to learn more about that. And then the last thing is, what excites you most about working with young people? So if you could just put that now in the chat, your name, your pronouns, the land you're on, and what excites you most about working with young people. So I'm reading folks in the chat. This is great to see some of the people contributing there. And the land acknowledgement link is actually if you scroll up, someone asked that in the chat to 5:39 p.m. It's there. Really great to see. Thank you all for being here. Next, we're going to introduce ourselves a little bit, slightly formally and a little bit less formally. And so Kristen's going to kick it off and introduce Amanda first.
Hi, I'm Kristen Gessling, and I get the honor of introducing my dear friend and colleague and inspiration, Dr. Amanda Wigger. Dr. Wigger is at Vancouver Island University. Her research is community-based research that encompasses literacies, languages, and the arts with local youth, families, and communities. She has co-authored or edited Art as a Way of Talking and the Reading Turnaround with Emergent Bilinguals, and many, many more publications, articles, and books. She is prolific. And I would say that one thing, this is our exciting less formal introduction, and I know that everyone's afraid of what we're gonna say about each other, but I met Amanda my first semester of my PhD program, and part of what Amanda's friendship and collegiality and kind of our relationship has provided to me as a scholar and as a human is the ability to have someone who is in it with you is essential. And especially when you're doing work that is maybe pushing the bounds of academia or your discipline, and you're trying to push social change and social justice, it's really, really crucial that you have people alongside you that you trust and that inspire you and that hold you accountable and push you to think and try and experiment in new ways. And I was lucky enough to meet Amanda at the very beginning of my scholarly journey, and I'm forever grateful.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marit Dewhurst, and I'm coming to you live from sleepy Brooklyn right now. So apologies for the dark background, but I'm happy to be here with everybody. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dana Wright, who many of you clearly already know. And as you can see on the screen, Dr. Wright's, her areas of scholarship include critical participatory action research, educational leadership, and critical youth studies. And she's the author of another book that is called Active Learning, Social Justice Education, Participatory Action Research. And I was lucky to meet Dana because she was actually my TA. So for those of you who are in her classes now, I understand the level of depth and criticality she brings to grading because she has graded my papers. And luckily, she does it with compassion and with such passion for encouraging young people and people of all ages, colleagues, to continually grow their research, to think in ways that really stretch what the status quo is teaching us to do, and to push towards a more radical vision of what education could be, what community can be, and what justice can look like. And I have the red marks on my papers to prove it. Additionally, I happen to know she's a bi-coastal hiker since she's a recent transplant over to your side. We were sad to leave her in our time zone, but happy that she's over there spreading the love. And a fellow cat owner and fellow lover of dancing to R&B hip hop. So that's my top secret information for you all listening. So Dana, I'm forever grateful that you were my TA.
And Amanda's going to introduce Kristen. Thank you, Marit.
Hello, everybody.
My name is Amanda Wigger. I'm currently in Comox territory on Vancouver Island. Thank you so much, Kristen, for your introduction. I am forever grateful to be working alongside you on this journey. So Dr. Kristen Gusling is, she's at Penn State in Brandywine. She conducts critical participatory action research in service of social movements. She strives to create spaces of belonging where people build meaningful relationships in the pursuit of liberatory social change. And I have been fortunate to witness that and hear the stories of her work, and it's tremendous. And I learned so much from working with Kristen. On a more informal note, Kristen gardens as a meditation. And one other thing is that I love about Kristen is that really wherever we are, if there's any sort of water, whether it be a pool, an ocean, a lake, she will jump into it just about any time of year. And it's inspiring on that note to just refresh yourself and jump in with her. And also just, she's been a mentor to me as well throughout these years of our programs together, and now our positions as professors. Nice to meet you all. Now it's Dana.
All right, so I'm Dana Wright, and I am on unceded Ohlone territory, which is also called Oakland, California. And I want to introduce Marit Dewhurst. Dr. Dewhurst at the City College of New York has worked as an arts educator in museums, juvenile detention centers, and international development projects. And she is the author of Social Justice Art, a framework for activist pedagogy. And I actually was talking with a colleague down the hall in my office, and he had the book on his shelf and teaches the book. So I was very happy to say I actually know the author of that book, and had great things to say about it, and his students as well. So that was great to hear. And so one thing about Marit is she recently gave a presentation in only present tense Spanish on social justice art education in Spain. And she's also a swimmer, does printmaking, has done some amazing stuff with museums in New York, and kind of teen workshops there and programming. And so, yeah, it was really great to meet Marit in graduate school, and to create this book with her and with everyone else as well. And so some of us met in grad school, and then also the rest of, in two pairs. You saw the other pair. And then we also really met at ARA, which is a big conference in the field of education that many of you are familiar with. So yeah, we're really excited to talk a little bit more about this book. So we could just go to the next slide and tell that story about creating the book in this moment. And Amanda's going to talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so this is a passage that's in the introduction of the book. I'm just going to read it because you are all probably reading it right now too. So please read along with me while I read it out loud. So we did not anticipate a deadly virus would sweep the globe and spotlight the ongoing economic, political, and social injustices in the United States, inequities in access, conditions, and protections stemming from historical intersecting systems of oppression and structural violence. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic came the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others that sparked the next iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement and ignited global protests against state-sanctioned anti-Black police violence. As Jennifer Ayala importantly reminds us in the preface of this book, these deadly structural toxicities are not new. So we pause to remind ourselves and our readers that we already have the instruments to transform destruction into possibility. Like any good song that keeps us moving when we are exhausted, we remember that creativity, relationships, and love sustain us through the ongoing struggle for liberation. This book brings together examples of collective projects that use the creative arts for social justice as a broader commitment to living that is generative, committed, truthful, responsive, creative, joyful, and relational. So again, that's the introduction. We had a theme that really ran through the book, which was music, and we talked about how this book was a playlist, and how that playlist kind of runs throughout the different movements, and how the music keeps going, and how sometimes we need to pause and listen, sometimes we need to like move on and jive. And it was a really good theme that we talked about, and we would send each other music and songs throughout our writings, and while reading and editing other people's manuscripts. So it was a really good theme for us, and we had a lot of good grooving while writing together.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And I want us to talk about our next slide. Kariana, if you could move to our hope for this book. So our hope for this book, this is another excerpt from our introduction. We wrote, "We consider this book an act of artful resistance. We aim to amplify the work of young people, artists, and scholars during this moment of possibility, as evidence of the ways in which our creative urgency drives conceptual and methodological innovations that can move us towards equity, liberation, hope, healing, transformation, and justice." Each of the chapters offer unique quote unquote songs with melodies of uplift and tensions, rhythms of dilemmas and resistance, and lyrics of liberation that encourage us to create humanizing spaces through embodied praxis for social justice. As such, they are potent reminders of the ways in which the arts serve to both crack open new worlds and escort us into them. And, it was really a particular moment, as Amanda talked about, that our book came about during the kind of dual pandemics and the Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd uprisings for racial justice. And so we had a lot of we were really aware of our ongoing social context in this country in particular, but also hopeful. So we're holding that tension, and we talk about that in the intro, and the pieces in the book also, the chapters of the invited authors and contributors really show that what's possible and the hope. So I want us to talk about our next slide that Amanda's going to talk about a little bit. We know that it is a little blurry, but Amanda just wanted to kind of point to Project South's timeline.
Yeah, thanks, Dana, Dr. Wright. So this, as Dr. Wright mentioned, it is a little bit blurry, but this is in the beginning of the book. It's a timeline called the Education for Liberation timeline. It was contributed by the movement building organization Project South, and it's really phenomenal. They show the history of education for liberation through economics, the top one, economic history, and then political history, and then movement and education. And they go through the different times, like starting with 1865 to 1900, and then about every 25 years and ending with our current time, and just, providing key moments in time of critical times that happened. For example, in the economic history, from 2000 to 2020, you have the China in the 2000s, China followed by India, emerge as financial global powers. And so just different things throughout the past 100 years that really influenced education in different ways. And this is youth created, again, by Project South, by the organization. And so we thought it was just a really good demonstration of activism through historical knowledge, and something that we were really grateful that they contributed to our book.
Thanks, Amanda. And we're going to move to our next slide. And Amanda's actually going to talk about that first theme in our next slide, which we're going to talk about the themes of the book, each of us.
So there were, the book was, we had 4 main themes that we talk about in the introduction. And we divided the different chapters in the book up by these 4 themes, but we say in the introduction that the themes overlap and that every different chapter included these different themes. So it wasn't just that because we had this first theme that those 3 chapters in that area were only about that theme. Really, every chapter in the book had in some way each of the themes that we're going to explain to you right now. So this first one, art as a rigorous medium for analyzing, producing, and sharing knowledge. So this theme is about the arts being central to this collection. And we acknowledge within this theme that the artistic process is the research, and rigorous research at that. Art is a medium that is our language of communication. It's a way of talking. When words do not suffice or cannot be said due to a variety of circumstances, from personal choice to erasure and silencing, artistic creations in turn speak volumes. So young people practice creative processes in their own ways for healing, for expressing who they are and sharing it with their friends, often via social media. Their creations spark relationships as one thing, and as the included authors note, art making as research is a unique experience that creates an opportunity to both make the world and build upon theory. So in reading the chapters for our readers, we urge the readers and researchers and students and others to reinvigorate their approach to the arts, moving it from the periphery to the center.
Thanks. And we can move to the next slide.
I think that's me. Yeah, okay. Our second theme is authentic reciprocal relationships matter. And again, as Amanda explained, this was central across all of the pieces in working with young people across age and intergenerational. The relationship has to be a central focus. And what the authors and contributions kind of share and elucidate about relationships is how they serve as a source of respect and require time and trust that honors the humanity of our collective work through deep listening, honesty, and reciprocity. The authors point out that we have to tend to relationships as part of this work, that it is actually an important piece of the labor, including relationships between young people and adults, between the young people and their peers, between young people and their communities and families, between adults and the field, and youth in the field. And we know that this relational work and relationality is not always elegant or polished as it can be when we put it on the page and when we theorize about it. Yet the challenges of cultivating such relationships that are nurturing in this work is key to make this a humanizing praxis, especially for young people who are marginalized in different ways. And I would say we do, but research isn't often considered a ripe space for work that centers people and the efforts it takes to nurture community. But the examples from our book and from arts-based youth participatory action research show us how it could be. And to support this kind of work, we have to move each other in order to prioritize and kind of dedicate the amount of time, resources, and accountability structures toward uplifting relationships as more important than grant deadlines, tenure processes, project appearances, or even our own internalized view of success. And that can be challenging, but it's also a source and a site of possibility.
Thank you, Dr. Gosling. And I'm going to talk about the next slide. So in this slide, we talk about the ways and in this theme in the book as well, we talk about how change can occur on multiple levels and oftentimes simultaneously. And the photo credit for this is Mestizo Arts and Activism, which is a organization that contributed to the book in the notes from the field. So while we're often trained, we talked about in this theme of the book, in this kind of section of the book, to isolate units of analysis to understand change, the collective of authors that contributed to this book remind us that change can occur simultaneously, right? It's an iterative process. It can occur on multiple levels. And that sometimes the change that these contributors write about is reflected at the individual level, right? In an individual's personal transformation. But at other times, projects or moments can disrupt systems. So at the systems level of policy or systems of practice and institutions, right? Schools, community-based organizations as well. And so we drew from critical theory. The authors often in this edited book drew from critical theory, and that notion that individuals and society are dialectically related, right? That consciousness is reproduced in and through meaningful social activity. And also this idea that individuals both produce and are produced by the systems that we seek to upend, that we seek to change and transform, and that people can change systems. So that hope and that agency that while systems are these huge structures in our society, individuals make up systems and that we can change those. And so we did urge the readers through this book to understand that even if change occurs on an individual level, that also might have a ripple effect, right? And that might, through youth development practices, as part of movement building strategies or activism or other socially engaged practices, can often ripple out to knock down larger policies and institutions and systems of oppression, right? So that there is this synergy, this connection between working at the individual, the institutional, maybe the ideological, and the systemic level, the systems level. So clearly, it goes without saying that some changes are easier to observe and measure in conventional metrics, right? But at other times, change is ephemeral, right? It's elusive. It's hard to pin down. And so the authors in this collection turn to creative forms that integrate metaphor and also imagination to overcome these limitations by synthesizing theory with experience through this emergent, dynamic process and frameworks that are in the making. So I want us to turn to our next slide, and Dr. Dewhurst is going to talk about that one.
Great. So the final theme that we had in this book is this idea that really, when it comes down to it, It's all about the praxis and the process. So all of the stuff that my colleagues have just been talking about, right? The relationships, the multiple layers of system analysis that are happening, the change on these different levels, the very engagement with text and ideas within a creative format. It all comes down to the meeting between the action and the reflection. And it's this constant cycle of that, right? So as Dana's talking about it being ephemeral and sort of hard to pin down, what we're saying and what the authors say in this book is that that's the point. It's hard to pin down because there's so much happening in that praxis, in that process. So we know that within the domain of conventional research, we take our research methods classes, and we know that we're taught that the goal that we should be focused on is the conclusions and the findings. Right, tighten those up, make sure that they're producible, publish them, get them out there. And what we're saying and what our authors say in this book is that with youth-led arts-based research, it's really, we're focused on the process. That's where the critical inquiry happens. That's where the imagination, that's where these portals of possibility get cracked open. So that way we can have real change in sometimes small ways and sometimes much larger systemic ways, as Dr. Wright was saying. And that these moments of inquiry and pedagogy are happening over and over again, right? So it's in those tiny little relationships that happen when participants meet with with an interviewee, or it's in, the larger presentation of the work, but it's happening all the time. And so we have to be attentive to that. And we're not necessarily taught to be attentive to that. So our authors in here give us a lot of opportunities to see how young people and adults work together to bring that praxis and that process to the forefront. They do it through their creativity, through the visual and theater and music, the analysis that they do through those art forms, and to make it more apparent. And it does all hinge on this idea of praxis, right? Which theory and practice coming together, action and reflection. And it's helpful and instructive for us to think about this because it gives us ways to understand moments of tension and conflict and the dilemmas that arise, the power differentials that arise when adults work with young people, when we're working towards social change, to start seeing that, oh, right, those moments of tension, those moments when we feel like, oh, this project might be failing, or all of a sudden it got messy. Those are the moments when things are really happening, right? That's where change is, that's where we're recreating new worlds. And our authors throughout the book demonstrate how this happens regularly, really airing the challenges of the work, which again, we're often not taught to do in conventional research methods, right? Don't show all your cards. And our authors say, actually, the good stuff is in all the cards. So make sure you're showing that, because that's the process. That's where we're learning and growing and recommitting to new worlds. And throughout all of this, all of our authors are asking us these questions about how we can continue to support and document these iterative cycles of reflection and action, right? So that we can really model and show that this is how we create change, right? This is how we make it visible. This is how we then spread it and through that ripple effect that we were talking about earlier. So these 4 themes we use them as kind of containers to hold the really fantastic contributions. And we do encourage you to check out the book because each of the authors come from all across the United States and Canada to offer really unique perspectives on what it means to work with young people. They're honest, they're authentic, and they're accessible, which I think is another rare thing in academic writing, is that the texts in our book are deeply accessible. So if anything we're saying here, you find yourself nodding, then, reach out to us. We'll share a code with you afterwards. But these are the ideas that folks are really lifting up through their work. We know we have some remaining time here, and I want to open up to a little bit of a conversation. Dana, is it okay if I just move us into the next one? So we're thinking about, we want to open up a couple of questions that we'll toss out to each other here, and give ourselves a moment to reflect on them as co-editors of this. We also encourage you to start thinking about any questions that you have. Maybe there was some comment in these themes that this sparked for you, or an experience that you're looking to tease out a little bit more. We'd love to hear your questions. So you could start formulating some of those in the chat as we go along. So the first question that we have, and this, I mean, really, this is a driving question for the whole book for us. This is probably what brought us together at that round table at AERA a million years ago. But this idea of why is it important to do this work in this current political context? And it's funny to ask that thinking about this book, right? Because we actually started this in an entirely different political context, and yet the work burned at that same rate as it does now. And yet so much has changed. So I'm curious about just how each of us is thinking about what some of the tensions and dilemmas are of this work in this particular moment on this particular November 9th at 9 o'clock on the East Coast. So I'll open that one up to folks.
I can speak just real briefly about a tension/dilemma that came up for me during COVID that I think is always present, but COVID and the uprisings and just whatever year that was, kind of whatever happened and all of that spotlighted tensions and dilemmas, I think, in every kind of domain of life. So I had kind of two active participatory action research projects going at the same time. And one is grounded in education, public education and education justice movement in Philadelphia. I'm on Lenape lands in Philadelphia. And the other one had to do with young people and the impact of the opioid and overdose crisis on young people in Philadelphia. And I think one of the tensions and dilemmas that I think we talk about, I know we talk about and grapple with is that kind of priority and the capacity issue. This is the conversation we have in organizing spaces around what's a priority, what do we have capacity for, what is our kind of end goal and trajectory. And for me, the research was not only in the back seat of everything, but the organizing, I also felt, I know within the organizing spaces that I sit in, it was really about making sure people had food, making sure people had Wi-Fi so that they could log in to school, making sure, that our students and families and people had their basic needs met. And we had a pretty heavy militarized presence in the city for the most of the summer. So it was about, are people feeling okay to go outside, do, like cars, picking people up, moving people around. And I think that when you're doing participatory action research, which is inherently political, it's inherently driven to create social change, and you're doing it in and with movements, that's an ongoing tension. And I think for me, it really brought it to the fore and kind of that shining light on values and priorities, which I know we manage and kind of hold a lot, but it was it gave me a different lens or vantage point to look at it.
Yeah, I think, Kristen, that's helpful to hear that too. And just thinking about these different lenses that the work, reading all the wonderful submissions that are in the text, and then the conversations with each other, and just thinking about this particular moment where I was just talking with a group of people recently about how dangerous it is right now that we are in a period where the opportunities for those relationships that are really about building reciprocity and building connection are so hard, right? They're hard across Zoom, right? It's hard to really be embodied with somebody. And a pattern that we've started to notice in a lot of conversations, right, is this the quickness to go to either this or that, right? And the sort of entrenched stances of like just not engaging with complexity or nuance. And I think what happens for me when I step back from that dangerous precipice and start thinking about, wait a second, like the work with these young people and the work with when we're intentionally crossing those power dynamics, right, to work with young people in these ways, and to think about how people outside of our own perspectives are seeing the world, and to lift those up, right, with a critical eye, that you can't do that in a two-dimensional way, right? It has to be complex. It has to be nuanced. You're going to bump into each other. And this kind of work encourages us to embrace that messiness and to say, right, like, yeah, we have to be in community with each other. We have to figure out how to navigate this together. And here are some tools to do it. And I think that's what feels right to me when I'm thinking about the work that is lifted up in this book, is that here, I think, we mentioned this at the very beginning, right? Our hope for this book is that here are some tools so that when it feels impossible, when the dangerousness of this moment feels like suffocating, like, how are we going to do this? How are we remaking these worlds as they're falling apart around us and also calcifying around us? How do we remake them? We have the tools. We can think creatively. We can work across differences. We can engage in the like gnarly messiness of what it means to try and do research that's about process and about praxis and about relationships and about layers of system analysis. So I think for me, it becomes this idea of like, all right, yikes, it feels a little bonkers right now, what we're dealing with in terms of the world. And yet we've got proven tools, and those tools are deeply rooted in history, right? They're coming from so far, and that young people know how to use them in the same way that a lot of our elders know how to use them. And it's about connecting that and getting it out there and focusing on that joy and focusing on that reciprocity can give us the stamina to keep going.
I can just add quickly that, we talked a lot about the urgency of the moment and of the historical moment that we're in. And also with, I think, the different layers of, we co-wrote our introduction together. And so we talk a lot about the disparities in, the way in which the COVID is hitting different communities, in particular Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, and we talked about kind of policies and practices that are impacting racial justice. And we talk about that a lot in the introduction as well, and how underfunded systems such as healthcare systems, but also housing and employment and all of these different systems create these inequities, right? I also want to see if Dr. Wigger wants to talk about this, say anything about this first question. And then we have the second question, but I also want to point out for those, because I know we only have, 10 or so minutes left. I was wondering if Kariana, you could show us the next slide for a quick second and then come back, because on the next one, it's really prompting you all to put your questions, and it's in the chat, but also feel free to write a question in the chat. And then when we get to this, maybe, some people might be able to unmute. So thank you. And we can go back to the other slide, but I also wanted, just before we end, I saw there was a question in the Q&A about this. This sounds like an excellent book that teaching artists would benefit from reading and kind of wanting to afford. There was a $160 hardcover price. Now it's $128, but there's a $39 ebook. So for those of you that are used to multitasking and remote environments, I did want to also put the actual publisher, Routledge, link there. And as Dr. Gosling mentioned, we can give a 20% discount code, but for the ebook, it's a little bit more affordable for teachers and students and others. So I see who are starting to put their questions in the chat, but I wanted to just see if Dr. Wigger wanted to talk to question 1 or question 2, or any of us wanted to talk to question 2 as well. And someone's going to read that out for us in a moment.
Thanks, Dana. I think there's a question in the chat, so I'll address that just because we are low on time, and It says, what do you find that youth want to change in themselves in this society? So I can, I'll speak from my own work on Vancouver Island. I have worked a lot with the Nanaimo community, which is Indigenous youth and Nuchalnith youth and Kwakwala youth, and those are the main Indigenous areas of the island. And so the youth in recently, in the most recent project, which was during COVID, youth wanted to address environmental issues. I worked with about 20 youth, and they wanted 20 Indigenous youth, they wanted to address environmental issues. Like, one of their research questions was, why are we the salmon's problem? Because the salmon are disappearing here. And they wanted to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That was a large topic that they questioned about, and police brutality. Those were, in working with the 20 youth that I worked with over the past year, those were the main 3 topics that came about. Something that was interesting and somewhat of a tension or dilemma is that in every time that we met, we had an elder present, and during COVID, to protect the elder, we had an elder from each of the different areas, Nuchalnith, Kwakwala, and Nanaimo. So we had 3 elders who were present at almost every meeting, and it actually helped for them to attend virtually in order to protect the elders. But a lot of the work that we do that I do with the youth is through language reawakening. And so the youth were asking how to translate certain things into their Indigenous language. And one of the tensions that came up was for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is that the elder said, we don't have a translation for that because we weren't worried about that. There is no words for that because that's just not something that we had to deal with. That was not our reality. And so that really brought about this whole conversation with the youth of like what that means for now, and with the elder, because the elder said, I don't want to even come up with a translation for that. So just the generational meanings and the evolution of language and the evolution of art through generations has been a beautiful tension and dilemma and creation all together.
One of the responses was, in my ECE classroom, we attempt to emphasize process with the children as we construct knowledge and work to create change. You mentioned visibility. What are some notable ways you recommend for making the change process visible to young people?
I can jump in quickly. I think, we haven't talked a lot about the content of the chapters and some of the examples in the book, but a lot of the chapters are on participatory action research. So young people actually engaging in the change process, and a lot of times middle school and high school youth, but also young adults. And so they're actually part of the change process. And a lot of times they're actually coming up with, this is the problem we want to solve in our community. We'll call it a research question, right? And this is the way in which we're going to really look at that problem and gather information and data and analyze it. And then with adults who are helping to facilitate as kind of in solidarity or allies, adult allies, helping them to gain those skills to analyze the data, collect it, whether it's in surveys or focus groups or interviews or other ways, observations. So a lot of the different chapters kind of speak to that. There's one chapter that I was just thinking about by Madeline Fox, Dr. Madeline Fox, in New York, that was talking about the ways in which theater is used by young people, and then looking at the audience gaze, and it can be racialized as well, and kind of looking at those dynamics as well. And there's a lot of different examples. Maybe other people can talk about a favorite example you know, from the book that speaks to kind of process, because I see there's a couple questions that are kind of around process and in the chat as well, and in the Q&A part. So maybe someone wants to speak to, I saw some nods, so maybe somebody wants to speak to a story, either your chapter that you contributed, because my three colleagues, we all contributed chapters, or one that just comes to mind right now in terms of process. What does it look like?
I can speak a little to that. I'm thinking about Madeline Fox's piece, and I'm also thinking about Keisha Green's. And we all read all of the chapters and kind of supported the authors through editing. And I think what the book actually does is, I think it's actually process. So part of why we picked those themes as a container was because we needed to create some structure. And what Dr. Wright was speaking about, and I think a couple others spoke about in terms of like what I found really beautiful in the contributions is how honest people were about how difficult this is. Because shifting from a product orientation to a process orientation is, you know, actually an act of resistance. It is counter to late stage capitalism and white supremacy. So it's even in that kind of shift in focus, you're embodying and engaging in resistance and change work. And so Dr. Green's piece is really kind of lovely in terms of it. She draws on her work from her dissertation through her career, and you see this kind of unfolding knowing and kind of critique of earlier practices and process to a new kind of theory and approach to the work. So what I think, and I'm just articulating this as I'm speaking, so I'm sorry if it's not very clear, but I think what people really did was engage in this work as an active process and kind of laid it out bare of like, this is where I am and it's in process and we're moving somewhere else quite quickly. But part of what I feel is that tension as a participatory action researcher is that we have to put something on the page, like as scholars, as people who are involved in kind of formal knowledge production, we have to pick arbitrary, maybe, endpoints so that we can kind of have that accumulation of a point of pause, if you're thinking about it from like Tuan's view of space and place, have pause, have reflection, in order for your consciousness to catch up and to keep moving with intention. But Marit's example to Simone about how she does this, I can attest. I've used Marit's mapping article with students, and I find that helpful. I think showing visual artistic work in different stages is a literal kind of representation of process. I think music might be, but I'm not a musician, but in my head, I'm like, that's got to have different layers. It's all layers, right? Thanks for those great questions.
The question was, how did young people's perspectives change through art, and what quality of art did you see, and did it affect a change in perspective?
I can jump in on that one. I started to answer it a little bit in the chat. And this has been a lot of my area of research for a long time, is like really looking at how young people describe their own sense of change and their own understanding of that. And so just this idea of these increased critical consciousness. So on the specific level, like their ability to name connections between ideas, or having a greater understanding, being able to articulate their own role as an agent in change. Just more awareness of nuance and complexity. So with that idea of making connections, right, that they're able to kind of connect the dots between a power analysis, that they have after doing a project versus before. And then I love this question about the question of the quality of the artwork. So I think that one comes up a lot, not necessarily in research spaces, but in other venues, right? Where people are like, but is this really artwork? I'm not sure. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is that, you know, obviously we can have like 100 years worth of Zoom webinars on what is art and what is quality of art. However, what it comes down to in a lot of these conversations is how effective it is and how aligned it is with the intentions of the project or the work, right? So like an artwork isn't going to move people if it's not executed with whatever the technical and specific material quality, quote, that is needed to connect with an audience, right? So basically there's a lot of ugly murals out there, right? However, I know, sorry, don't quote me on that. But we can tell that there are ones that if we really engaged in the process, if that praxis is happening, if we're really thinking about what is the best way to convey a message, what is the best tools that we can use to get this idea across, to connect these concepts, then we're going to be able to use the materials and methods and techniques to align with the goals. And so I think that's a constant question to ask. And it's one of those big tensions in this work, but it's one of the, you know, we love to call things generative tensions, right? But it's the tension that gets you going. So I know we're at time, right? Sorry.
No, I think that's really helpful. And you're the director of art at CUNY, so art education.
No, don't tell them I said that.
No, but I think also the power mapping that you mentioned, I just want to say, you know, that there's a lot that runs through the different pieces. So some are like community organizers or organizing groups that are doing some artwork in the service of social change. Some are artists that are doing community change work, you know, and people are coming at it from different places. And I think that richness and range really kind of reflects what's happening on the ground. And then also there's like Dr. Amanda Wigger does a lot of pedagogy of the, theater of the oppressed work. And so there's theater and different ways. You know, my piece talks about young people using kind of a role play skit, but it's in the lineage of theater of the oppressed techniques to talk about anti-Black racism and police violence and against Black and brown young men. And it's by the young men, and they're doing these role plays to deal with the daily frisking that they have just walking around in their neighborhood, you know, visiting their grandmother, going to do an errand. And so being able to talk about the shame, the rage, the anger, the injustice, the humiliation, the urge to change at a social systemic level and at the community level, that through their personal experience, through art, is very different. You know, I write about how, you know, it's very different than if they were doing that through maybe writing a research paper, right? Which are all important ways, but a lot of these different pieces and the different chapters talk about how art is an essential piece, right? And a way to analyze, to produce knowledge, to build knowledge, but also to have moments of kind of self-reflection, joy and humor in the difficulties that we face collectively and individually. And so, you know, there's just a lot of, there's also art in the book. So we haven't said that, you know, directly, but, you know, it was something that the publisher wasn't as used to in an academic book, but made space for when we, you know, wanted these notes from the field and these actual, you know, there's also people who are writing for a page and a half or so with a picture or image or artwork. And you saw that throughout our slides where those, some of those that's representing, this is what we do. right, as on the ground. And so it's that mix of scholarship, research in the more traditional or somewhat traditional but participatory ways, and then people who are community-based groups. So I know that we're at time. We should probably call it. Okay.
Yeah, Dana, I would just say that, you know, I think one of the best parts of, I mean, obviously we're deeply biased. However, the best part of doing this process, and I think what pulled us through doing it in the midst of all these pandemics and the chaos of trying to do this during Zoom, was how deeply we believe in this work and that it's quality. It needs to be lifted up. There are so many people doing it, and they're not necessarily getting sort of the accolades that typically people get in academia. And yet this is where it's at. And so, you know, we encourage you to check it out, you know, bug your library to get it if it, you know, if the cost is too much. Email us if there's anything that you know, want to see or hear from about that. Check out the table of contents and just email those authors directly. But there's really useful, inspirational stuff, and it's accessible. So hopefully you can find some tools in it that you can apply in your own work, whether you're teaching, organizing, researching, all the things. And thanks for being here.
Yes, thanks everyone. I guess we can unmute and say thank you, just the panelists, but thank you everyone. We really appreciate your time and engaging with us through the chat and your questions. And as Dr. Dewhurst mentioned, please reach out to us if you want to continue the conversation or have questions. We're all, you can find our faculty pages and our emails and reach out to us. So thank you.
I got a shout out to Gritty in the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks,
and thank
JC.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks for having
everybody.
us. Take care.